Welcome, nocturnal historians. Tonight's story starts with a claim that sounds insane. Nazi Germany never actually paid for World War II. It ran the entire Third Reich on fake money, stolen gold, slave labor, and a national-scale Ponzi scheme so unstable that peace itself would have collapsed the economy faster than any bomb. By 1939, Hitler wasn't just choosing war for ideology. He needed new countries the way a drowning man needs air, just to keep his own system from imploding. In this episode, we'll whisper our way through how a fake company, invisible debt, and looted nations turned economics into a death machine. If that kind of hidden history keeps you awake at night, get comfortable. Leave a comment where you're listening from, and let's follow the money. The year is 1923, and Berlin, the proud heart of Germany, finds itself shrouded in a peculiar, almost surreal snowfall. Yet, it isn't flakes of white descending from the winter sky, but a flurry of paper. Each note is a desperate cry of a nation in distress. Under the fractured, yellowed glow of the streetlights, countless banknotes drift through the air like ash, remnants of a value long evaporated, carried by the indifferent breeze through a city on the brink. This quiet, monetary blizzard is the tangible manifestation of a collapse so profound, so dizzying, that it beggars belief. Imagine the despair that must settle upon a household when the very symbol of their labor and future becomes less valuable than the simplest means of survival. Families, huddled against the biting German winter, might gaze at their cold, empty stoves, longing for warmth. But then, a stark, heartbreaking reality would set in stacks of currency, once carefully saved, now served a more practical purpose than their printed worth. These paper notes, destined to purchase goods, were cheaper to burn as fuel than the lowest quality firewood. The cruel twist of hyperinflation had stripped away not just wealth, but dignity, reducing the nation's currency to mere kindling. It filled the frigid air with the acrid, telltale smell of scorched paper, a fragrance that spoke of ruin and desperate measures, permeating through every alley and echoing the silent pangs of empty stomachs. This wasn't merely an economic downturn. It was an implosion of reality itself. Hyperinflation, that insidious phantom, didn't just consume savings slowly over time. It vaporized stability in an instant, leaving behind a vacuum of fear and uncertainty. The prices of everyday necessities, from a simple loaf of bread to a few ounces of meat, would climb at an astonishing, dizzying pace, faster than one's own breath could condense into a visible cloud on a frigid winter morning. A single loaf of bread, the most fundamental sustenance, could demand the entire life savings of a middle-class home, reducing years of diligent work and frugal living to nothing more than a fleeting moment of caloric intake. The social fabric itself began to fray under this immense pressure. In the lengthening shadows of soup lines, bankers, once symbols of financial security and prestige, stood shoulder to shoulder with decorated war veterans, whose valor seemed to count for nothing now, and diligent teachers, whose knowledge could not feed their own families. All were equal in their hunger, stripped bare of their former stations, united by the gnawing emptiness in their bellies and the chilling fear in their hearts. This was a society where the traditional markers of success and worth had dissolved, leaving behind a stark, unsettling equality of destitution. At this precise moment, The monstrous ideology of Nazism had not yet seized control. Its dark banners had not yet unfurled, nor had its fervent rallies filled the streets. But something far more primal, far more pervasive, had already taken root. Fear. This was not the sudden, sharp fear of an approaching army, but a slow, creeping dread that permeated every aspect of daily life, a constant companion to every decision, every hunger pang. Fear, in its most fundamental form, had taken power, silently reshaping the national psyche, eroding trust, and whispering promises of salvation into the ears of a desperate populace. This all-consuming fear created a profound, almost spiritual, needed desperate longing for a savior, a miracle worker, a financial magician who could somehow conjure stability out of thin air, who could make money live again, breathe life back into a dying economy. Every eye, glazed with exhaustion and anxiety, searched the faces around them, scanning the newspapers, listening to the radio, for someone, anyone, who possessed the secret, the wisdom, the power to restore order and meaning to their shattered world. It was in this cold, flickering glow of broken streetlights, amidst the raining ashes of worth, that a figure named Hjalmar Schacht watched in silence, observing the chaos with an almost unsettling calm. This man, who understood the profound, destructive power of money as ashes, would soon step into the void. Germany, in its desperate search for a miracle, did not yet realize it would entrust its very future to the hands of the one who truly grasped the nature of ash. And he knew, deep within his keen financial mind, that no miracle, especially one born of such desperation, ever truly comes without a staggering price. Into this maelstrom of economic desolation, where the very concept of money seemed to be an elaborate, cruel joke, stepped Hjalmar Schacht. He entered the annals of history not as a warrior or politician, but like a skilled surgeon meticulously entering a failing ward. His demeanor was calm, his gaze analytical, his presence commanding a quiet authority. The patient, Germany, was hemorrhaging value, its financial lifeblood draining away, threatening to leave a lifeless husk. Schacht's approach was unconventional, his methods seemingly counterintuitive in a world obsessed with tangible assets. His primary tools were not traditional gold reserves or vast sums of foreign currency, but rather the subtle, intricate instruments of psychology and the cold, unyielding precision of a master craftsman. He understood that in a crisis of faith, belief itself could be a more potent force than any physical backing. With a bold stroke, Schacht birthed the Rentenmark, a new currency designed to replace the virtually worthless Reichsmark. Its genius lay not in its backing by traditional precious metals, which Germany simply didn't possess, but in something far more intrinsic to the nation itself, its land. The Rentenmark was nominally collateralized by the entire agricultural and industrial wealth of Germany, specifically through a general mortgage on all real estate. This was not a real, physical gold standard, but a powerful psychological trick. The stability of this new currency was derived, paradoxically, not from an inherent, unassailable strength, but because people, weary and desperate for an anchor, chose to believe in its promise, It was a shared act of faith, a collective will to make it work, that breathed life back into the German economy. The sheer relief, the collective sigh of a nation, was palpable. The effect was nothing short of miraculous, at least on the surface. Inflation, that monstrous, galloping beast that had devoured savings and dreams, froze almost overnight. The dizzying, daily climb of prices came to an abrupt, almost eerie halt, as if a fever had suddenly broken. The frantic rush to spend earnings before they became worthless ceased. A semblance of order, a fragile peace, descended upon the marketplace. Newspapers, breathless with relief, hailed Schacht as a genius, a financial wizard who had pulled Germany back from the brink of utter ruin, a man whose intellectual prowess had saved them from the abyss. The nation, collectively, breathed a sigh of temporary relief, clinging to this newfound, fragile stability. Yet, beneath Schacht's remarkably calm and composed exterior, a deeper, more unsettling truth gnawed at him. He possessed a keen, almost surgical insight into Germany's true, underlying illness, a malady far more insidious than mere hyperinflation. The nation had no meaningful gold reserves, no indigenous oil to fuel its industries, and a desperate scarcity of foreign currency. Germany, despite its newfound paper stability, remained a nation breathing through foreign credit, much like a gravely ill patient reliant on borrowed oxygen. Each breath was fragile, each moment contingent on the goodwill and lending capacity of other nations. This reliance was a ticking time bomb, a fundamental vulnerability that haunted Schacht, even as he was lauded as a savior. Then, with the brutal force of an unforeseen natural disaster, the 1929 Great Depression struck. This global economic cataclysm, originating across the Atlantic, resonated with devastating force across the weakened economies of Europe, and particularly in Germany. The oxygen tube, so precariously connected, suddenly snapped. Banks, already fragile from years of instability, failed catastrophically, pulling down businesses and entire industries in their wake. Factories, once humming with the promise of reconstruction, choked on vanished orders and frozen credit, their silent machinery standing as monuments to broken dreams. Hope, that most precious commodity, collapsed under the weight of renewed despair, leaving a profound void. Germany, once again, found itself staggering precariously on the edge of another abyss, the fragile illusion of stability threatening to shatter entirely. A currency stable only on paper echoed with a renewed, ominous resonance. The years between 1929 and 1932 plunged Germany into a chasm of economic despair, far deeper and more insidious than the previous hyperinflationary crisis. This time, the economy did not merely spiral, it flatlined, a lifeless monitor signaling the cessation of vital signs. Banks, the very arteries of commerce, died en masse. Their doors shuttered, their vaults empty, taking with them the last vestiges of trust and stability. Industries, once the engines of national pride, suffocated under the weight of zero demand and unavailable credit, their smokestacks silent, their workshops still and cold. The nation became a silent graveyard of labor, with 6 million souls standing idle, their skills wasted, their spirits broken. Imagine the quiet desperation then of a skilled engineer whose hands once built intricate machinery, now begging for any form of work. Or a learned professor, once imparting wisdom, now reduced to selling his worn coats on a frigid street corner, just to put food on the table for his family. This was a generation stripped of purpose, dignity, and hope. This time, the crisis manifested differently. It wasn't that money had lost its value. It had simply ceased to exist, vanishing from circulation, frozen in the grip of a global credit crunch. The government's response, rooted in traditional austerity measures, only served to worsen the collapse, tightening the screws on an already desperate populace. Exports, once a lifeline, fell off a cliff as international trade evaporated, leaving German factories with no markets for their goods. This economic strangulation created a fertile breeding ground for radicalism. The streets, once filled with the quiet desperation of the unemployed, now erupted into violent clashes. Communists, promising a workers' paradise, battled fiercely with the rising tide of Nazis, who offered a brutal, nationalistic vision of revival. The very foundations of the Weimar democracy, already fragile, buckled and began to crack under the intolerable pressure of economic misery and political extremism. Amidst this chaos, a new voice began to resonate. Loud and clear, Adolf Hitler. He stood before the masses, a mesmerized nation hanging on his every word, offering a potent cocktail of promises. He vowed to bring jobs, to restore dignity, to rearm the nation, and to orchestrate a miraculous revival of Germany's shattered pride and economy. His words were a siren song to the desperate, a balm to the wounded national psyche. Yet, crucially, he offered no concrete, rational explanation as to how he would pay for any of these grand pronouncements. The mechanisms, the financial blueprints, remained shrouded in vague rhetoric and fiery nationalist slogans. The details, he implied, would simply manifest through sheer force of will and a renewed national spirit. But then, a quiet whisper entered the ear of this charismatic leader. It was the voice of Hjalmar Schacht, the financial wizard, who possessed a chillingly pragmatic understanding of how to bend reality to political will. "I know a way," Schacht is said to have murmured, a simple phrase pregnant with immense, dangerous possibility. It was a way, he understood, that lay far outside the conventional textbooks of economics, beyond the strictures of legality, and certainly outside the comforting boundaries of traditional stability. It was a path that promised a miracle, but one built upon shadows and hidden costs. This period taught a chilling lesson: when money disappears, extremism fills the void. And so, the dice were cast. Hitler, riding a wave of popular desperation and fervent nationalism, seized power, becoming the Chancellor of Germany. In a chillingly synchronous move, Schacht, the architect of temporary stability, took the reins of the national treasury, becoming the president of the Reichsbank and later the Minister of Economics. The two men, one a demagogue, the other a financial architect, had found their moment to create the miracle that Germany so desperately craved. They understood. They would need a vast and impenetrable shadow to hide the true cost, to conceal the bill that would inevitably come due. Their collaboration would prove to be one of the most consequential and ultimately catastrophic in modern history. With the Nazi regime firmly in power, Schucht, now holding the powerful office of Minister of Economics and President of the Reichsbank, set about orchestrating what appeared to be an economic marvel. He revived the German economy with a forceful injection of stimulus, a strategy that, on the surface, bore a striking resemblance to the massive public works projects and job creation initiatives of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States. Roads were built, infrastructure projects launched, and a massive re-employment drive began, seemingly pulling Germany out of the depths of the Depression with astonishing speed. The unemployment rolls, once tragically swollen, began to shrink, and a palpable sense of purpose, however manufactured, seemed to return to the nation. But this civilian spending, this outward show of economic recovery, was merely a carefully constructed mask. Beneath this veneer of domestic prosperity, the true, insidious core of Schucht's economic plan lay hidden an aggressive, unprecedented expansion of military spending. Every new road, every revitalized factory, every newly employed worker was ultimately channeled towards the insatiable demands of rearmament. Tanks, planes, warships, the sinews of war, became the true beneficiaries of this economic stimulus. The nation was being secretly, systematically transformed into a colossal war machine, all while presenting a facade of peaceful recovery to the world. To prevent the classic pitfalls of such massive government spending, namely rampant inflation, Schucht implemented a series of draconian controls. Wages were rigidly frozen, ensuring that workers, though employed, remained permanently poor. Their purchasing power deliberately suppressed. This created a docile workforce, compliant out of economic necessity, unable to demand higher pay that might fuel inflationary pressures. Simultaneously, prices for goods were also frozen. A direct governmental intervention to prevent them from rising freely, which would have exposed the true inflationary pressures lurking beneath the surface. These price controls, while preventing visible inflation, had a devastating consequence on consumer choice and availability. Import controls were also tightly clamped down, severely choking the flow of consumer goods from abroad. While this limited variety in stores and stifled individual consumption, it strategically funneled the nation's precious foreign currency, which was in scarce supply, towards the vital raw materials and strategic goods needed to feed the burgeoning military industries. Germany effectively became a repressed economy, a tightly controlled financial ecosystem where jobs indeed rose, offering a sense of stability, but living standards stagnated or even declined. The illusion of a booming economy was meticulously maintained, but the average German household felt little of its benefit. The state, under Schucht's precise direction, controlled every essential resource: steel, coal, rubber, oil. All were rationed through state-mandated quotas, diverted from civilian use to military production. This command economy ensured that the war machine received priority, even at the cost of widespread shortages for the populace. While growth figures looked impressive on paper, painting a picture of robust economic health, the reality in German households was one of hollowness, of sacrifices made for a purpose they were only dimly aware of. Hitler, emboldened by the apparent success, continually demanded a tenfold expansion of the armed forces, pushing the economic engine to its absolute limits. But a critical problem loomed. Germany had virtually no foreign reserves left to pay for the massive imports of raw materials required for such an ambitious military buildup. To print money openly to cover these costs would inevitably ignite the dreaded specter of hyperinflation once more, shattering the fragile stability Schacht had so carefully constructed. This became their guiding principle. A miracle exists only if its receipts stay hidden. Schacht, a master of financial sleight of hand, began to prepare the stage for the greatest financial illusion in modern history. One that would simultaneously fund a war and keep its true cost invisible. A ghost company, born of paper and deception, would soon rise to feed a very real, very hungry army. The year is 1934, and, with the economic stage meticulously set, Schacht unveiled his masterstroke of financial deception, the creation of a company that, in all but name, existed purely as a phantom. This entity, grandly named Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or MAFO, was capitalized with a mere 1 million Reichsmarks, a paltry sum for a national enterprise. Yet, this paper-thin company was destined to secretly generate an astonishing 12 billion marks, becoming the silent, invisible engine powering Germany's rearmament. It was an audacious, almost poetic act of financial prestidigitation, designed to defy conventional economic logic. The core mechanism of this illusion was the Pretz MAFO bill. These were essentially promissory notes, issued by MIFO, promising repayment in 5 years. The genius of the scheme lay in their acceptance. Arms firms, tasked with churning out tanks, planes, and artillery at an unprecedented rate, accepted these MIFO bills as payment for their goods and services on their balance sheets. These bills appeared as a legitimate, government-backed financial instrument, seemingly no different from any other commercial obligation. The illusion was meticulously maintained at every step of the transaction. Here's where the true deception took hold when these arms firms needed actual cash to pay their workers and suppliers. They would take their MIFO bills to commercial banks. These banks, in turn, were assured by the Reichsbank, Schacht's own institution, that it would secretly honor these bills, converting them to cash whenever presented. The Reichsbank, effectively bust, printed money to redeem these MIFO bills. But critically, it did so off the books. This newly created money, essential for funding the gargantuan military buildup, never appeared in the national accounts. It was a parallel financial universe, perfectly invisible to both the German public and, more importantly, to foreign observers who might otherwise have detected the telltale signs of rampant rearmament and runaway inflation. The system worked brilliantly, at least for a time. Foreign nations, carefully scrutinizing Germany's economic data, saw no overt signs of inflation, no massive increases in military expenditure reflected in official budgets, and no dramatic surge in the money supply. They saw only a nation seemingly pulling itself out of the depression through hard work and clever internal policies. Meanwhile, beneath this tranquil surface, Germany was creating a parallel financial universe, a hidden engine of war production fueled by invisible debt. Factories across the nation roared back to life, their chimneys spewing smoke, their assembly lines churning out the tools of conflict. The economic recovery, fueled by this clandestine funding, accelerated at a dizzying pace, giving Hitler and his regime immense credibility both domestically and internationally. However, Schacht, with his keen financial foresight, knew the truth all this apparent success. This robust recovery rested precariously on an ever-growing mountain of debt, the MIFO bills, which would mature in 1939. And Germany, despite its booming factories, had no genuine, legitimate means to pay off this colossal, invisible debt. This precarious situation perfectly encapsulated the truth: invisible debt swells beneath visible success. A ticking time bomb had been set, its countdown barely audible beneath the roar of the factories. Schacht understood implicitly that when this invisible debt matured, when the bills came due for all the tanks, planes, and artillery, only one grim solution would remain: conquest. Only by seizing the wealth of other nations could this house of cards be prevented from collapsing. The brilliant, yet ultimately unsustainable economic system crafted by Schacht created a peculiar and deeply repressive reality for the German people. On the surface, the nation presented an image of full employment and industrial dynamism, a stark contrast to the despair of the early 1930s. However, this stability was built on the foundation of the populace's suppressed desires. Wage freezes, rigorously enforced by the state, kept workers employed but simultaneously ensured they remained permanently poor. Their daily labor contributed to the national output, but their purchasing power remained stunted, preventing any genuine improvement in their quality of life. It was a form of enforced contentment, where the promise of a job was traded for the reality of stagnant wages. Similarly, price freezes, another cornerstone of Schacht's system, prevented the visible manifestation of inflation. The government dictated what goods should cost, stopping the dizzying price escalations that had traumatized the nation in 1923. But this artificial stability came at a severe cost: empty store shelves. With prices artificially low and demand for goods rising due to employment, producers had little incentive to bring products to market, leading to widespread shortages. Consumers would walk into shops to find them bare, a frustrating reality that stood in stark contrast to the official pronouncements of economic prosperity. The government was, in essence, trying to command supply and demand, a battle it was destined to lose. Beyond wages and prices, the state exerted absolute control over vital resources. The rationing of critical materials like steel, coal, copper, and oil transformed Germany into a command economy, a nation where every ounce of productive capacity was directed by central planning. Private enterprise, while still existing, found its operations tightly controlled, its output redirected to serve the state's overarching militaristic goals. The choice was clear if prices were allowed to rise freely. The underlying inflationary pressures, fueled by the invisible MEFO money, would instantly reignite hyperinflation, unleashing economic chaos. But if prices remained locked, shortages would inevitably spread like a creeping mold, gradually eroding the quality of life and creating immense frustration among the populace. Germany, faced with this grim choice, opted for shortages. Anything, they believed, was preferable to the return of the devastating inflation of the 1920s. This meant that inflation wasn't truly gone. It was merely imprisoned, held captive by the iron will of the state's economic controls. The MEFO money, the engine of rearmament, circulated almost exclusively within the industrial sector, funding the production of war materiel. It did not significantly flow into the hands of citizens, thus preventing a surge in consumer demand that would have shattered the price freeze. The economy, therefore, projected an image of stability and strength. But beneath the surface, it was structurally suffocating, slowly depleting its own internal vitality. The average German consumer, living in the late 1930s, experienced a quality of life that more closely resembled the austere, difficult conditions of the early 1930s Depression, rather than the boom years the official propaganda proclaimed. The state, with meticulous precision, manipulated every valve of demand, carefully allocating resources, suppressing consumption, and channeling all national energy towards its overarching goal. Germany, even before a single shot of World War II was fired, had already become a war economy, a nation entirely mobilized for conflict. It was an era characterized by a chilling truth fire trapped beneath the floorboards. The flames of inflation and popular discontent were not extinguished. They were merely contained, smoldering in the shadows, threatening to break out and consume everything in their path the moment the state's iron grip faltered. The ambitious and ultimately destructive rearmament program faced a fundamental, insurmountable hurdle. Germany, despite its industrial might, was a nation woefully starved of critical natural resources essential for modern warfare. Oil, the very lifeblood of mechanized armies and air forces, was scarce within its borders. Rubber, vital for tires, seals, and countless military applications, was virtually non-existent. Key minerals like bauxite for aluminum and nickel for steel alloys were largely absent. Hitler, with a characteristic blend of ideological fervor and willful ignorance of economic realities, demanded autarky, complete economic self-sufficiency. It was an impossible mandate for a resource-poor nation, a fantastical dream destined to shatter against the hard truth of geology and geography. Desperate to overcome these limitations, the regime poured immense resources into developing synthetic alternatives. Scientists and engineers toiled to produce synthetic fuel from Germany's abundant coal reserves. While technically feasible, the process was incredibly expensive, energy-intensive, and the resulting output was never sufficient to meet the ravenous demands of a burgeoning military. Similarly, synthetic rubber, known as Buna, was developed, yet it proved to be an inferior product, prone to cracking in the cold, melting in the heat, and consistently underperforming its natural counterpart. These substitutes, while technologically impressive, were costly compromises, a constant drain on resources that could have been used elsewhere. The drive for self-sufficiency extended to agriculture. As workers were siphoned off from farms to factories to fuel the industrial war machine, agricultural output struggled. Despite propaganda extolling the virtues of German soil, the nation found itself still importing significant quantities of animal feed, fertilizers, and even basic foodstuffs, in addition to metals and other raw materials. The grand vision of autarky was exposed as a myth, a dangerous delusion perpetuated by ideological zeal. The German economy, despite its outward appearance of strength, was becoming a precarious machine built entirely on scarcity, an elaborate structure perpetually on the verge of toppling. Shocked, the pragmatic financial mind understood these inherent limits with chilling clarity. But Hermann Göring, the head of the powerful four-year plan and a fervent believer in Hitler's ideological dictates, possessed no such nuanced understanding. Göring, driven by ambition and a superficial grasp of economics, dismissed Schacht's warnings, advocating for an even more aggressive militarization of the economy. Ultimately, Hitler sided with Göring, his own blind faith in the power of will overriding any economic caution. The four-year plan became a blueprint for total economic militarization, diverting virtually all national resources, energy, and labor towards war preparation. The consequences for the civilian population were severe. Civilian consumption collapsed to pre-depression levels, signaling a return to austerity despite the supposed economic boom. The nation became a vast factory, perpetually churning out weapons, but simultaneously starving its own people of basic goods and a decent quality of life. Autarky, therefore, was not a utopian dream of national independence. It was, in its stark reality, a chilling prelude to war, a desperate measure to acquire by force what could not be produced or purchased. This was an economy without oxygen, a nation whose very breath depended on resources it did not possess, and which it was now determined to seize by any means necessary. By 1937, the intricate web of financial deception woven by Hjalmar Schacht began to unravel in his own astute mind. He, perhaps more than anyone, could see with terrifying clarity that Germany was not merely heading towards an economic downturn, it was sprinting, full tilt, into an inevitable, catastrophic collapse. The delicate balance he had so meticulously crafted, the illusion of stability, was cracking under the immense pressure of Hitler's insatiable demands for rearmament. With a grim sense of duty, Schacht confronted Hitler, delivering a stark warning: cut military spending, or we will crash. It was a moment of profound truth, a direct challenge to the Führer's escalating militarism, and a desperate plea to avert a disaster Schacht knew was imminent. Hitler's response was immediate, chilling, and utterly uncompromising. His eyes, burning with fanatical conviction, dismissed Schacht's economic realities with a single, brutal declaration: war is the solution. For Hitler, economic problems were not to be solved through prudent fiscal policy, but through violent expansion. The raw materials and financial resources Germany lacked would simply be seized from weaker nations. It was a terrifying glimpse into the mind of a dictator who saw conquest not just as a political goal, but as an economic imperative, a grotesque answer to an unsolvable financial equation. The ticking time bomb Schacht had warned about was the maturity of the Mafo bills. In 1939, these billions of marks in invisible debt would come due, demanding repayment. The financial options were vanishing rapidly. Germany could not borrow abroad. It had already defaulted on its international debts in 1934, making it a pariah in global financial markets. Raising taxes significantly was also impossible. The German public was already squeezed dry, their living standards deliberately repressed to fund the war machine. Printing money openly, as Schacht well knew, would instantly trigger a return to the devastating hyperinflation of 1923, an outcome the regime feared above all else. And cutting the army, that was political suicide for Hitler, whose power was predicated on the promise of national revival through military strength. With all conventional and even unconventional financial avenues closed, only one terrifying option remained to loot a nation that possessed gold and foreign currency, a nation whose wealth could be plundered to temporarily plug the gaping holes in Germany's balance sheets. Austria, Germany's southern neighbor, with its modest but real gold reserves, became the first inevitable target. Schacht, the pragmatic financial wizard, recognized that this decision crossed a fundamental line, not just economically into legalized theft, but morally, into a realm of pure aggression and violation. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of economic crisis, fractured irrevocably at this moment, broken by the stark realization of what Hitler's solution truly entailed. The harsh reality was that a miracle must be fed something real. The next miracle, The next postponement of financial reckoning would be paid for by an entire country. March of 1938 dawned with a chilling significance, marking a pivotal moment in Germany's economic and political escalation. Without firing a shot, Austria, a sovereign nation, fell under the Third Reich's dominion in an event termed the Anschluss. It was a swift, almost silent annexation, but its financial implications reverberated like a loud alarm bell through the halls of global finance. Immediately, the vast majority of Austria's gold reserves, meticulously accumulated over generations, were systematically siphoned off and flowed directly into the coffers of the German Reichsbank. This illicit transfer of wealth was a literal injection of precious metal into Germany's anemic economy, providing a much-needed, though fleeting, stabilization. The influx of Austrian gold and foreign currency served a critical, immediate purpose. It temporarily plugged the gaping holes created by the impending deadlines of the MEFO bills. The phantom debts, due to mature in 1939, could now be papered over, postponed, and partially settled with real, tangible assets. This acquisition of wealth was not limited to gold. Austrian banks and savings accounts were systematically confiscated, their assets absorbed into the German financial system. Austrian industry, once vibrant and independent, was forcibly integrated into the burgeoning German war machine, its factories repurposed, its production quotas dictated by Berlin. This was not a partnership or an alliance. It was an act of economic piracy on a national scale. For Germany, this was nothing less than an oxygen infusion for its increasingly fragile, Ponzi-like economy. The appearance of renewed financial health, however ill-gotten, allowed Hitler's propaganda machine to spin a compelling narrative. The annexation was presented as an act of economic genius, a brilliant expansion that brought prosperity to both Germany and, ironically, to Austria itself. Despite the reality of its plunder, Hitler claimed an economic invincibility, a unique ability to expand and enrich the Reich simultaneously. In truth, it was nothing more than legalized national theft, a desperate act of resource acquisition driven by impending financial collapse, not by sustainable economic growth. Hitler, buoyed by the ease of his conquest and the temporary economic reprieve it provided, dangerously mistook this plunder for genuine, organic growth. He began to believe that expansion, the violent seizure of neighboring nations' assets, was a viable and repeatable economic model. Yet, the underlying MEFO debt, the original sin of shocked system, continued to grow, a monstrous shadow expanding with each new act of aggression. The inherent logic of a Ponzi scheme demands new victims, a constant supply of fresh capital to pay off older obligations. And this pattern was now established. Germany was now breathing through the wealth of others. The world's alarmingly weak reaction to the Anschluss only served to embolden Hitler, reinforcing his belief that the international community lacked the will to stop him. And with this success, the stage was set for the next victim, one even richer, whose resources would be essential for the beast's continued sustenance. The ease with which Austria had been absorbed, and the immediate economic benefits reaped, only served to whet Hitler's appetite for further expansion. The next target, Czechoslovakia, represented an even more significant prize, not just for its gold reserves, but for its formidable industrial might, particularly in the realm of arms manufacturing. At its heart lay the Skoda Works, a colossal complex recognized as the most advanced arms factory in Eastern Europe. A crown jewel of industrial capability, Germany, wasting no time, swiftly seized control of this critical facility, instantly boosting its armament production capacity to an unprecedented degree. This was not merely an acquisition, it was an assimilation of a vital military-industrial asset, ready to churn out weapons for the Reich. The plunder continued beyond factories and machinery. The substantial Czech gold reserves, like Austria's before them, were systematically transferred abroad, but into German hands, bypassing any international scrutiny that might have raised questions. This newly acquired foreign currency became a crucial lifeline, used by Germany to purchase essential war materials that it desperately lacked oil to fuel its tanks and planes. Tungsten for hardened steel, and nickel for critical alloys. The seizure of Czechoslovakia was a strategic economic coup, directly addressing Germany's most pressing resource deficiencies and significantly enhancing its military readiness. The very economy of Czechoslovakia was brutally gutted, its resources and industries repurposed to serve the German war machine. What was once a vibrant, independent nation was reduced to an economic tributary, its wealth flowing directly into the Reich. This fresh infusion of assets had a direct, palpable impact on Germany's internal financial crisis. The looming deadlines for MIFO payments, which had been temporarily staved off by Austrian wealth, were now extended for another year, buying the regime precious time and maintaining the illusion of financial solvency. The quantitative impact was undeniable. German artillery output surged dramatically, directly attributable to the incorporations of Czech industrial capacity. The Skoda works, once a symbol of Czech prowess, now hammered out instruments of German aggression. Hitler, intoxicated by these seemingly effortless economic gains, began to solidify his dangerous conviction that military expansion, the continuous seizure and plunder of neighboring nations, was a sustainable, permanent economic model. He believed that conquest was the ultimate solution to Germany's resource constraints, a never-ending source of raw materials and financial injections. Shocked, long out of the picture by this point, would have understood the profound self-deception in this belief. Without the resources ruthlessly extracted from Czechoslovakia, Germany's war economy, already running on fumes, would have collapsed far sooner, unable to sustain its aggressive pace of rearmament. However, this reliance on plunder created a deepening addiction. Each act of theft temporarily solved an immediate problem, but simultaneously increased Germany's dependence on future conquests. The Ponzi scheme, now fully operational on a geopolitical scale, required constant new hosts, new nations to exploit, to keep the illusion alive. This was industry hollowed out to feed a ghost debt. With Czechoslovakia plundered, Germany now turned its gaze toward the next extraction, a prize that promised not just resources, but millions of workers to exploit in its burgeoning war machine. With Czechoslovakia stripped bare, Germany's insatiable war machine, still fueled by the specter of MIFO debt, looked eastward towards Poland. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the brutal start of World War II. But it was also a strategic economic imperative, a desperate grab for vital resources and, perhaps most cruelly, for human labor. Poland, with its fertile plains, offered something Germany desperately needed: food. Grain harvests and livestock, once sustaining the Polish population, were now systematically requisitioned to feed both the expanding German army and, just as importantly, to provide for the German civilian populace, whose own living standards were being steadily eroded by the demands of war production. Beyond agriculture, Poland possessed significant industrial assets. The Silesian mines and factories, rich in coal and other vital resources, were quickly absorbed into the German war economy, further strengthening Germany's steel production and heavy industry. This systematic exploitation of Polish resources provided another crucial, albeit temporary, reprieve for Germany's faltering financial structure. However, the most chilling aspect of the Polish conquest was the shift in Germany's predatory economic model. Germany moved beyond merely plundering assets, gold, and industrial capacity. It began to plunder people. Polish citizens, men and women, were rounded up, dispossessed, and forced into labor, becoming cogs in the vast German war machine. This was not an accidental byproduct of war. It was a deliberate economic policy. Millions of Poles were forced to work in German factories, mines, and farms, effectively becoming enslaved. The MIFO debt, which now stretched into astronomical figures, was in a grotesque sense paid for not with gold or currency, but with the forced labor of Polish bodies, the coal from their mines, and the food from their fields. This exploitation, brutal and systematic, allowed German living standards, particularly for civilians, to temporarily stabilize, shielding them from the true costs of Hitler's war. The suffering of the conquered fueled the fragile comfort of the conquerors. The invasion and exploitation of Poland marked a critical turning point. This was, in essence, the last time Germany could attempt to balance its precarious Ponzi scheme with a massive infusion of plundered resources and slave labor on this scale without triggering a wider, more devastating conflict. The war, which began as an economic necessity to avert internal collapse, now became an unavoidable, self-perpetuating economic policy. Victory fueled further expansion, providing new resources and labor, while any defeat threatened to trigger an instant and irreversible economic collapse. Germany had transformed itself into a slave labor-dependent system, a parasitic economy that could only breathe by consuming the resources and lives of others. Expansion was the only oxygen left. Germany, having depleted its eastern neighbor, now cast its gaze even further eastward, towards an infinitely larger prize, a prize that promised not just gold and grain, but the vast oil reserves crucial for its mechanized war. The lightning victory over France in 1940, a stunning military triumph, was immediately converted into an unprecedented economic windfall for the Third Reich. With its swift conquest, Germany imposed a staggering demand. France was forced to pay 400 million francs per day in occupation costs. This wasn't merely a punitive measure. It was an ingenious, if morally reprehensible, economic strategy. In essence, France was compelled to finance the very army that occupied its territory, a chilling arrangement where the vanquished sustained their conqueror, ensuring that Germany's war machine could continue its operations without internal financial strain. The plunder extended far beyond daily payments. French gold and foreign currency reserves, substantial assets of one of Europe's wealthiest nations, were systematically seized and funneled directly into German coffers. This massive influx of real, tangible wealth provided another critical, though temporary, lifeline for Germany's perpetually indebted war economy. Beyond financial assets, the industrial heart of France was swiftly pressed into service. Factories in Paris, Lyon, and across the occupied zones, once producing for the French economy, were now repurposed to serve German war production. Their output, from machinery to textiles, was rerouted to Germany, bolstering the Reich's industrial capacity and alleviating its own resource shortages. France effectively became Germany's treasury for the Western Front, its vast resources underwriting the cost of the conflict. Railways, once carrying French goods to French markets, now bore French coal, French machines, and French foodstuffs eastward, across the Rhine, to feed the German war effort. This systematic exploitation meant that German civilians, insulated from the direct costs, barely felt the strain of the war, at least in its early stages. Their living standards, despite being a nation at war, were surprisingly stable, thanks to the immense wealth being siphoned from conquered territories. The Mayfo debt, the phantom financial instrument that still underpinned Germany's military spending, was delayed for yet another year, bought off by the sheer magnitude of French wealth. Hitler, witnessing this seemingly limitless flow of resources, became even more entrenched in his belief of economic invincibility, convinced that conquest alone could sustain his regime indefinitely. The reality, however, was far more precarious. Germany's apparent prosperity was entirely dependent on draining other nations dry. It was an occupation economy, a parasitic system that replaced real productivity with brute force extraction. This model, while effective in the short term, was fundamentally unsustainable. This was a nation forced to feed its conqueror. Yet, as the war machine expanded, the demands shifted. This model, while providing francs and industrial output, crucially did not provide enough oil, the ultimate indispensable resource for a fully mechanized war. And oil, the Reich knew, lay not in the west, but far to the east. The swift conquests of Western Europe brought immense wealth and industrial capacity. But they failed to solve Germany's most critical and ultimately fatal vulnerability, the profound lack of oil. Oil was not merely a commodity. It was the very bloodstream of the German war economy, the indispensable fuel that powered its tanks, planes, trucks, and naval vessels. Without a secure and abundant supply, the entire mechanized military machine, the very instrument of Hitler's aggression, would grind to a halt. Germany's indigenous synthetic fuel program, despite enormous investment and scientific effort, could only cover a fraction of its staggering needs. It was a stopgap measure, never a genuine solution. The reliance on external sources was absolute. Without the oil fields of Romania, a crucial early supplier, the Wehrmacht, the mighty German army, would be unable to sustain prolonged operations, its vehicles stalling across the European landscape. The stakes grew even higher without the vast, coveted oil fields of Ukraine and the Caucasus. The entire Mayfo system, the financial bedrock of Germany's rearmament, would collapse instantly, defaulting on its massive, invisible debts and plunging the nation into an economic abyss. Thus, the war with the Soviet Union, known as Operation Barbarossa, transitioned from being a purely ideological crusade to an undeniable economic necessity. While the regime trumpeted an ideological struggle against Bolshevism, this was largely a mask, a convenient narrative to obscure the brutal truth oil was the primary, compelling motive: the tanks, the planes, The millions of trucks that were poised to invade the Soviet Union all ran on fuel. Fuel that Germany did not possess in sufficient quantities and could not purchase. The entire strategic calculation hinged on seizing these vital oil fields. Yet, with a terrifying short-sightedness, Germany never had enough oil reserves for more than approximately 24 months of full-scale war. Time, therefore, became Germany's most implacable enemy, relentlessly ticking down toward an inevitable energy crisis. Hitler, consumed by his vision of rapid conquest, believed that victory over the Soviet Union would simply buy him limitless time, securing all the necessary resources for a 1,000-year Reich. Schacht, long sidelined but ever the pragmatist, understood the profound fallacy in this belief. Raw materials cannot be conjured from ideology. Hermann Göring, with his inflated boasts and fundamental misunderstanding of industrial capacity and logistics, consistently miscalculated Germany's ability to sustain its energy demands. Germany was a nation indebted in barrels, not banknotes. The financial Ponzi, originally built on hidden money, now became a desperate gamble on the availability of a physical commodity, forcing it to accelerate to its most dangerous and ultimately self-destructive gamble, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941, represented the ultimate, desperate gamble of the Third Reich. Its true goal, beneath the fervent ideological rhetoric of destroying Bolshevism and creating Lebensraum, living space, was fundamentally economic resources, specifically the vast agricultural lands of Ukraine, the legendary breadbasket of Europe, were coveted to feed the German population and army, while the immense oil reservoirs of the Caucasus region were the prize that would unlock Germany's long-term war potential and finally solve its critical energy problem. Conquering both, Hitler believed, would not only provide an inexhaustible supply of food and fuel, but would also, crucially, pay off the colossal and growing MEFO debt by force, sustaining the financial miracle he had so desperately cultivated. Hitler, with his characteristic blend of strategic audacity and profound hubris, wagered the entire German economy, indeed the very future of the Reich, on the success of this single, gargantuan invasion. If successful, the financial miracle would be sustained indefinitely, the Ponzi scheme seemingly vindicated by the scale of its plunder. If it failed, however, the entire edifice would collapse overnight, leaving Germany with insurmountable debts, exhausted resources, and a military machine starving for fuel. The stakes could not have been higher. But the Soviet Union, facing an existential threat, refused to be a passive victim. Stalin's brutal, yet strategically effective, scorched earth policy denied Germany the very resources it sought to seize. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and critical infrastructure annihilated before the advancing German forces could capture them. The German supply lines, stretching for thousands of miles across vast, unforgiving terrain, became hopelessly overextended. Fuel, always scarce, drained faster than it could be captured or transported, crippling the mobility of the German army. Then, with devastating force, the Russian winter descended. The frigid temperatures crushed German mobility, freezing equipment, incapacitating vehicles, and solidifying the mud into impassable ice. The promised oil from the Caucasus, just beyond their grasp, never arrived in sufficient quantities to turn the tide. The German losses, both in men and material, were catastrophic, crippling the economic output of the Reich. Factories at home, already stretched to their limit, struggled to replace the immense quantities of tanks, planes, and vehicles destroyed on the Eastern Front. Barbarossa, rather than securing Germany's economic future, became an economic bankruptcy filing in slow motion. It drained resources, consumed manpower, and exposed the profound fragility of Germany's war economy. Germany's debt was measured in miles of frozen road. Germany was no longer just fighting armies, it was fighting time, and time was rapidly running out. The labor needed to sustain this unwinnable war. The regime now understood would have to come from chains. By 1942, as the brutal reality of the Eastern Front began to drain Germany of its manpower and resources at an alarming rate, the nation faced an impending labor collapse. Millions of German men were now fighting or dying on distant battlefields, leaving a critical void in factories, farms, and mines at home. The solution, implemented with horrifying efficiency and callous disregard for human life, was the systematic importation of an estimated 12 million forced laborers from across occupied Europe. This vast, captive workforce, comprising Poles, Soviets, French, Dutch, and many others, became the grim, indispensable engine of the German war economy. The critical industries that fueled the war machine, coal mining, steel production, chemical manufacturing, armaments factories, were built, quite literally, on the enslaved bodies of these desperate individuals. Slave labor was not merely an unfortunate consequence of war. It was a deliberate and calculated economic policy, integrated into the very fabric of German production. Without this massive influx of coerced workers, German output, already strained, would have dropped catastrophically, bringing the war effort to a grinding halt. Major German corporations, from industrial giants to agricultural enterprises, seamlessly integrated slavery into their normal operations, viewing human beings as mere units of production, disposable and replaceable. In this horrifying system, death was not a concern, but an anticipated statistic. The brutal conditions, starvation diets, and relentless work schedules meant that forced laborers died at alarming rates. Yet, for the regime, labor was simply replaceable. There was always another trainload of captives to be brought in from the occupied territories. The war economy had effectively become a death economy, a system where productivity was mercilessly extracted through terror, violence, and systematic dehumanization. Germany, facing a perpetual shortage of its own resources, substituted these missing inputs with human suffering, turning millions of lives into a grotesque form of capital. This was a Ponzi scheme whose interest payments were now measured not in marks or gold, but in human lives. Chains became the pillars of Germany's GDP. The official economic statistics, showing continued industrial output, masked the profound moral and human cost underpinning them. But even this vast pool of enslaved labor, however immense and cruelly exploited, could not compensate for the most critical deficiency: empty oil tanks. Human effort, no matter how intense, could not conjure petroleum from thin air. The regime, reaching the limits of external plunder and forced labor, now began a more insidious, desperate act, stealing from its own citizens. As the war dragged on, and the vast plundering of occupied territories became insufficient to sustain the insatiable German war machine, the regime began to turn inward, systematically stealing from its own citizens. The financial noose tightened quietly and insidiously, beginning with hidden levies and surcharges that caused taxes to rise without overt announcements. slowly eroding the purchasing power of the average German household. Workers were then subjected to more overt forms of coercion, forced to buy war bonds they could not refuse. Their wages effectively siphoned off to fund a war that was increasingly demanding more and more. One particularly infamous instance of domestic plunder was the Volkswagen scam. The regime encouraged millions of Germans to save up for the people's car, the Volkswagen Beetle, through a mandatory savings plan. Hundreds of thousands diligently contributed their hard-earned money, accumulating a staggering 275 million Reichsmarks. Yet, not a single civilian car was ever delivered. The funds, instead, were systematically diverted to finance military production, leaving the trusting citizens empty-handed and their dreams of car ownership shattered. This was a direct, state-sponsored theft from its own loyal populace. The state's avarice extended to private wealth. Gold ownership became illegal, and private hoards of gold and other precious metals were seized, confiscated under the guise of national necessity. The collective wealth of individual Germans was incrementally absorbed into the war effort. More broadly, food rationing, initially a measure to ensure equitable distribution, became increasingly severe, pushing civilians to the brink of starvation, to levels reminiscent of the crisis years of 1932. While propaganda relentlessly insisted on prosperity and national sacrifice, the reality on the ground was one of pervasive hunger and desperate scarcity. As official channels starved the population, black markets flourished, becoming the only recourse for many to obtain basic necessities. This widespread illicit trade was a direct symptom of an economy devouring its own population, cannibalizing its citizens' well-being for the sake of a failing war. Germany could no longer sustain its own people, having prioritized the military machine above all else. The Ponzi scheme, having exhausted external victims, now transitioned to internal cannibalization, consuming the very population it claimed to protect. Loyalty, once inspired by promises of prosperity, was now enforced by the brutal reality of scarcity and control, ensuring compliance through the threat of even greater deprivation. The empire was now feeding on itself. The collapse, it was now clear, was irreversible, merely awaiting its final, brutal manifestation. The year 1943 stands as the indelible marker of economic death for Nazi Germany, a moment when the illusion of strength finally crumbled under the weight of an unsustainable system. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, far more than just a military setback, signaled a profound shift in Germany's economic fortunes. It marked the definitive end of the possibility of new territorial gains, and with it, the cessation of new plunder. The lifeblood of Germany's Ponzi scheme, the acquisition of foreign wealth, resources, and labor, stopped completely. The external wellspring had run dry, leaving the war machine to gasp for breath. With no new territories to loot, the inflow of critical resources ground to a halt. The desperate scramble for oil became a losing battle. The oil supply collapsed, leaving vast numbers of vehicles, tanks, and aircraft sitting idle, useless, their engines silent. Steel and coal output, once the pillars of industrial might, fell sharply, crippled by bombing, labor shortages, and the inability to import necessary raw materials. Food shortages intensified dramatically across the Reich, weakening the civilian population and impacting the workforce. The synthetic fuel and rubber programs, always expensive and insufficient, could no longer bridge the ever-widening gap between demand and supply. They were admirable scientific feats, but utterly inadequate to sustain a continental war. The MFO bills, the grand illusion that had funded the rearmament, had effectively defaulted. Without new plunder or viable means of repayment, their inherent worth vanished, exposing the sham. While official prices remained controlled, inflation, long imprisoned, broke free into the burgeoning black markets, where goods traded at astronomical prices, reflecting the true, terrifying devaluation of the currency. The sheer scale of war production, pushed beyond all rational limits, finally exceeded Germany's economic capacity, even with the cruel efficiency of slave labor. The nation was fighting a total war without a functioning economy to support it. A monstrous contradiction that spelled inevitable doom. Invisible money dies before visible armies. The financial deception that had built the war machine had reached its natural end, expiring long before the last German soldier laid down his arms. The illusion of economic strength, so carefully constructed over a decade, crumbled into dust, revealing a hollow shell. The final audit was drawing near, a reckoning that would expose the true cost of a war built on lies and plunder. As 1944 bled into 1945, the final brutal audit of Nazi Germany's war economy began in earnest. The once mighty industrial base, the very foundation of the war machine, was systematically pulverized by relentless Allied bombing campaigns. Critical factories, transportation hubs, and, most devastatingly, oil facilities were destroyed beyond repair. The infrastructure that had once allowed for rapid movement of troops and supplies now lay in ruins. Its arteries severed, its veins collapsed. This physical destruction crippled Germany's ability to produce or distribute anything, severing its internal supply chains and bringing industrial output to a virtual standstill. The vast network of slave laborers, once seen as an inexhaustible resource, began to die faster than they could be replaced, succumbing to starvation, disease, and the horrors of the crumbling regime. Even this cruel exploitation, which had propped up so much of the war effort, could no longer sustain the collapsing edifice. The Reichsbank, once the engine of Schacht's financial wizardry, was utterly empty, its vaults devoid of gold, foreign currency, or any meaningful assets. The nation's financial heart had ceased to beat. In this terminal state, no taxation was possible, the populace had nothing left to give, and the administrative structures were in chaos. Printing money, the only remaining option for a desperate regime, triggered runaway inflation, a final facade, convulsive echo of 1923, but this time with no Hjalmar Schacht to engineer a recovery. The German economy entered a state of terminal failure, a complete systemic collapse. Germany could no longer sustain either its war effort or, tragically, the basic needs of its own citizens in peacetime. The Ponzi scheme had reached its total and absolute default. The illusion of a self-sustaining economic miracle, so carefully cultivated and violently enforced, was revealed as nothing more than a colossal lie. An economy that dies when plunder ends. The post-war economic life of Germany would have to begin from zero, a nation literally starting from scratch, its currency worthless, its cities razed, its industries shattered. Yet, the blueprint of this destructive economic model, the insidious architecture of its financial deceptions, remains a chilling warning to this day. The economic system of Nazi Germany, initially hailed as a miracle, proves to be a chilling blueprint for a fundamentally unsustainable model. It functioned only when expanding, perpetually consuming new territories, new resources, and new populations to exploit. The moment that expansion ceased, the moment the flow of plunder stopped, the entire structure was destined for inevitable collapse. For the Third Reich, war was not merely an ideological choice or a means to an end. It was an economic imperative. The only way to sustain a system designed for ceaseless aggression. We can distill this destructive economic blueprint into 5 core pillars, each interconnected and mutually reinforcing. 1. Shadow money, a clandestine financial instrument. The MEFO bills used to fund rearmament off the books, creating invisible debt and masking inflationary pressures. 2. Repressed consumption. Strict wage and price controls, rationing, and import restrictions that kept citizens poor, store shelves empty, and resources diverted to the military. 3. Forced labor. The systematic exploitation of millions of enslaved individuals from conquered territories, essential to maintain industrial output as domestic manpower dwindled. 4. Looted reserves. The brutal and systematic seizure of gold, foreign currency, and industrial assets from annexed and occupied nations, providing temporary infusions of real capital. 5. Military first allocation. The absolute prioritization of military production over civilian welfare, transforming the entire economy into a giant war machine. Crucially, none of these pillars could function in peacetime. A shadow money system relies on deception that would be exposed in open markets. Repressed consumption stifles innovation and demand, leading to stagnation. Forced labor is a crime against humanity and unsustainable in a civilian economy. Looted reserves are finite and require constant warfare to replenish, and a military first allocation starves the civilian sector, leading to a diminished quality of life. The Nazi model, therefore, was not one of sustainable growth. It was a system of relentless extraction, draining wealth from others until there was nothing left. Hitler, in his megalomania, profoundly mistook plunder for genuine productivity, believing that the seizure of assets was the same as creating new wealth. Shocked, the architect of the early deceptions miscalculated the ultimate limits of illusion, perhaps believing he could control the beast he helped create. And the world, tragically, misread Germany's carefully manipulated economic numbers, failing to see the true, precarious nature of its supposed recovery. Every Ponzi scheme, whether financial or geopolitical, begins as a miracle, dazzling with its initial returns and apparent success. But every miracle built on such a foundation inevitably ends with a devastating bill, a reckoning that demands payment in the most horrific currency imaginable. Miracles demand repayment in blood. This history reveals that the dangers repeat through underlying financial structures, not just through ideologies. It forces us to ask, with a quiet urgency which MEFOs exist in our world today. The economics of Nazi Germany, far from being a complex, unfathomable mystery, stands as a stark and terrifying warning, a profound lesson about the nature of power, deception, and the fragility of financial stability. It demonstrates with chilling clarity that any nation, under the right conditions of fear and desperation, can create the illusion of economic health, can falsify stability through sheer repression and meticulous control. Any government, driven by ideological fervor or desperate ambition, can systematically hide inflation, suppress discontent with a blend of fear and pervasive control, and manipulate public perception to create a narrative of prosperity amidst scarcity. The story of the Third Reich's economy illustrates that any miracle, particularly an economic one, can be fabricated on paper, meticulously constructed with financial sleight of hand and deliberate obfuscation. But there is a fundamental, immutable truth: resources, the tangible inputs that sustain life and industry, cannot be faked. They are finite, real, and subject to the laws of physics and geography. Nazi Germany ultimately collapsed not primarily from military defeat on the battlefield, though that was certainly the final, crushing blow, but from running out of these real inputs, from exhausting its ability to acquire and produce the actual resources required to sustain its war machine and its population. The MEFO system, that grand invisible financial structure, represents the inherent danger of shadow finance, of creating debt and liquidity outside transparent and accountable systems. It highlights how such mechanisms can be used to fund destructive ambitions while deceiving both domestic and international observers. The Nazi experience also underscores a grim reality when a state prioritizes war production above all else. Human welfare becomes a secondary concern, sacrificed on the altar of military might. This is always a temporary, unsustainable arrangement, a short-term gain for a long-term, catastrophic loss. Empires, or indeed any economic system, built on theft and plunder are fundamentally unstable. They collapse inevitably when the flow of stolen wealth ceases, as they lack any genuine, productive foundation. This history teaches us that economics often shapes warfare more profoundly than ideology alone, serving as a silent, powerful undercurrent that dictates strategy and ultimately destiny. The tragic reality is that Ponzi systems, these illusions of endless growth and prosperity, continue to exist in the modern world, perhaps under new names, cloaked in different rhetoric, but still driven by the same unsustainable logic of endless expansion and deferred reckoning. The ashes of 1923, the scent of burning banknotes and shattered trust, still drift into the present, carried by the subtle currents of history, whispering warnings to those who choose to listen. If these hidden economic narratives and the profound lessons they contain keep you awake at night, stirring your thoughts, I invite you to share them. Comment below with your reflections. Which modern systems, in your view, resemble the MEFO illusion the most? And what lessons can we draw from Germany's tragic economic blueprint? Your insights enrich our shared journey through history. Now, as the last echoes of our journey fade, allow yourself to simply be. Dim the lights a little more. Embrace the quiet calm of the night. And remember that history, in all its intricate details, often whispers its most profound truths through numbers and economic structures, far more subtly than through grand pronouncements. Let these thoughts gently settle as you drift towards a peaceful night.